am a fiction writer, so I'm a complete imposter in this company of literary critics. And so my first question has to be, when I hear the term literary critic, I immediately have this vision in my head of the Armada having arrived in the port and that bombing is about to start in 2 minutes. So that's my view of literary criticism. And so my question, and perhaps my only question, is literary criticism, what is it good for? Vanessa, would you like to take that?
Well, it depends on, yeah, okay. What is it good for? Well, for one thing, I mean, there's one thing, one of the questions that we had discussed earlier was book reviews. And I have lived in a society, which is Pakistan, for very many years where there were no book reviews. And I know how difficult it was for an avid reader like me to be guided or to know what was available in the market, what was coming out. So that's one type of literary criticism, that is the book review, which has an immediacy, which is what journalists are given books to review, which is what I did for a very long time. Where I graduated into that, what I call literary criticism, is to then place a work within a larger context, within a historical context or within a social context. And if you take, let's go, I'm actually trying to do, because my traditions are English, but so I'm going into Urdu, but if you take something that is so pivotal to our literature, like the Progressive Writers Movement. The Progressive Writers Movement developed because our writers and readers read Marxist literature. They read Marxist literary criticism. Now, later on, you can challenge that Marxist view. I mean, it doesn't have to be absolute, but it creates a very lively dialogue, and the Progressive Writers Movement transformed our literature. They said, you look at the social reality, you look at the lives of the poor, then later on, when people like Ahmad Ali broke away, and then they started another discourse. So it places, I think, writing and literature within a wider context. I can go on about other things, but I think I've said enough.
Yeah, well, I've been confronted with this question often enough. Sometimes in a mood of disappointment, I say, well, what are birds good for? They're also good for something. Well, literary criticism is I think let me be a little pretentious and say, is the activity of the civilized mind. It helps one to discriminate between what matters and what does not matter, what is important in the making of a society, and the ways in which a society either does think of itself or ought to think of itself. So yes, literary criticism matters enormously in helping make discriminations about what I'm calling what matters.
So it helps to make discrimination.
It helps to make discriminations between what matters and what does not matter, what is ephemeral or what is not ephemeral, what is merely passing fashion, what abides in that sense.
Does the ephemeral have any value?
Ephemeral has a value in the sense that it builds or helps create a larger literary and cultural tradition. But what survives eventually is the best of that tradition, to which the ephemeral has contributed also. It's not hasn't contributed. So that would be my initial reaction.
Yeah. Stefan?
Well, of course, literary criticism is always a discussion about literature. When I write or when I publish a review, I'm trying to start a discussion about literature with other readers, with the readers of my review, with the author, with other literary critics, and so on. But I think it's important here to see that we have two kinds of understanding of literary criticism. I think in the English-speaking world, if you talk about literary criticism, you often mean academic criticism, which is some kind of research work. Maybe it's meant mainly for understanding and not for making up an opinion. So as far as I'm concerned, I've worked in both fields, and also I've been reviewed, and I'm a reviewer. But to my mind, I think it's important to bring both of them together, to bring understanding, research, and opinion together, because this was the beginning, the original beginning of literary criticism, especially in Germany. When the German Romantics talked about Goethe's works, for example, about Wilhelm Meister, Schlegel, for example, talked about Wilhelm Meister, it was a mixture, it was an essay, what we would call an essay today. It was an essay which mixes literary criticism in the sense of understanding, of researching, and contextualizing, and opinion, of praise and recommendation. And the same, there's a whole tradition of that, I think not only in the German-speaking world. There's no German-speaking world. There are parts of the world speaking German, in comparison to the English-speaking world, which really exists.
A world into itself, yes.
But there's a tradition in Germany of that kind, which goes until famous examples, for example, of Walter Benjamin, when he talks about, also about Goethe, about the elective affinities, which is, by the way, inspired by Marxist criticism and so on and so on. As far as my personal work is concerned, it's important to note that I've specialized in reviewing literature from, let's say, in reviewing Oriental literatures. And that does not mean English-speaking literatures. I review mainly, for most of the big German dailies, I review Arabic and Farsi literature. I would also review Urdu literature, but there's nearly any Urdu literature translated into German. As far as the English-speaking Pakistani or Indian literature is concerned, this is regarded by the responsibles in the dailies mostly as some kind of world literature or as a Commonwealth or British literature, and therefore is not regarded as something for a specialist like me. Which is a funny point of view, but on the other hand, I think it's right, because I would not venture to review German writers of Turkish origin who write in German, because this goes into the field of those who review German literature because they write in German. You know, like Hanif Qureshi's work should be reviewed by those specialized in English literature and not in Urdu literature, which would be funny to do.
Well, that gives us a segue.
I'd like to think of this from a slightly different point of view, because I'm a writing teacher. And I think it's very important and very creative for young writers who are just starting out on their first novels, films, plays, etc. I think it's very important for them to have a reader. And as a teacher and my other colleagues who are teachers, what we do, we are the first reader, as it were, for our students. And we give a straightforward response. And there is somebody there for the students. And when people first begin to write, it's very important that they have a sense of a reader, of there being somebody else there at all to hear them. So you read someone's book and you say, well, the reader needs to know by page 3, by 7, by second chapter, they need to know this amount of information in terms of the story. If you think of a novel as really being, it's how you give somebody information and when you give them the information, and obviously a thriller works, much more straightforwardly in that form. So I don't think of criticism in this sense as being a sort of a Levicite critique of what they're doing, but the sense that for the young writer, there is somebody there following the instructions, which is what, in a sense, a book is. A book is a collection of instructions for an experience that will take place in your head. So, for me as a writer, I'm not interested in on the whole, on what people say, after you've written the book, it's too late. But it's very important, I think, for young writers to have early readers, so that, as it were, the writer doesn't believe that they're just hallucinating, that they are indeed communicating with someone else. And I think that's what I can do as a teacher, what other people can do as teachers. And that, in that sense, criticism then really serves the writer. And to me, that is a real use rather than the stuff that comes afterwards.
Thank you. I would have to say, as I also write, and I would have to look at it from that point of view as well and agree with that. I was very nervous about moderating this panel, and I asked a lot of writers how I should go about doing it, and asked Claire, who's in the audience, and Mirza Waheed the other night. And Mirza Waheed mentioned a book of yours, Hanif. He said it's such a gentle, wonderful book, and probably the best book he has read on the subject. And it's called Dreaming and Scheming. And will you please tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Dreaming and Scheming is a book of essays about writing, about the experience of being a writer, what it is to write, and really about what it is to find readers, particularly early on in your career when you need to find somebody who can talk about writing in a way that enables you to write better the next day. And I encourage my young writers to work in groups with other writers. Sometimes they write together in each other's houses. They have writing groups. You know, they'll write until lunchtime, and then they'll gossip, and then they'll write again, and so on. So really it's a way of thinking about how isolating writing is, and also the desire to speak, the desire to communicate to a reader, to find a reader. And a lot of young writers don't keep the reader in mind. They don't have the reader in mind. You say to the students, listen, you've introduced 5 new characters on this page. I can't work out who they are and what they're doing. And you can see that the writer has lost sense of where the reader is. This isn't really criticism, but it is being a good reader, and they're quite similar things, I think, as Munisa was trying to say.
And another question that thank you. Another question that I asked people, or they told me, well, the literary criticism is important for how would we have understood Joyce if we didn't have a good critic to contextualize Joyce's work? Munisa, would you or anyone here want to answer that?
Well, one of the functions of literary critic clearly is, as he says, to be a good reader. But in order to be a good reader and to advise a young novelist, the person concerned has also to have an enormous background of learning about the ability, what I'm calling, to make discriminating choices. Only then can I become an advisor. Now, as far as giving the advice goes to a novelist, a young novelist as an example, one would probably have to say that the function of a novelist, as a critic one has to say, the function of a novel is not to write editorials or preach or teach, but to be a unique artifact in itself. And that is where the critic also comes in, is to decipher and decode that artifact for others who may not have access to that information. So your specific question about Joyce would require necessarily for me to have some way of acquiring the analogical range that exists in not just Dubliners, but certainly Ulysses, and of course, more certainly in Finnegan's Wake. So you require a critic. But the critic's function is, of course, also to decode, but also to decode texts in some ways which are difficult texts. You have posed the question of Joyce. You have not posed the question of Chetan Bhagat. Right? I mean, Chetan Bhagat doesn't require a literary critic. Yeah? He requires only a reader who responds emotionally to it. But there is a need for a literary critic for a great text, who then places that text within a certain context, because literary Joyce is all the time in conversation with other texts. He's not in conversation only with himself or with his reader directly. He is also in conversation with other texts, of which he is as aware as a literary critic ought to become. So without that awareness, a detailed understanding or an attempt at an understanding of Joyce becomes almost impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah? So in that sense, the literary critic plays a major role in defining the sensibility within which Joyce is writing, and against which, or perhaps with it, he is writing within that tradition. So it's absolutely important.
The question of Joyce is kind of extreme because Joyce is an extreme example. So it's taking it from the point of view of the literary reviewer, not the academic critic. I can just tell you what happened to James Joyce in Germany in the 20s. The book Ulysses was translated fairly early into German, I think in the mid of the 20s. And it became famous, or it was famous before, I guess, just because it was forbidden in many parts of the world, because it was too sexually explicit. This is why it became famous, and then it was translated into German very early, and was very influential, especially on some writers, like Döblin, who wrote Berlin Alexanderplatz, or Hermann Broch, another German-Austrian writer. So it became very influential, but taken from the reviews, if you read now the reviews on this translation, or on Ulysses of James Joyce in Germany in the 20s, you'll be surprised because nobody liked the book. The reviewers did not like the book, and understandably enough, because it is a difficult book. It is not a book which is made for readers. It's not, I think if somebody writes now like James Joyce, I don't know what Hanif would say to his students if they start to do so, because it will be very difficult.
Well, let's find out what Hanif
I will ask him that. It will be very difficult for the readers. It is still a difficult book. I mean, if you have tried to read it, it takes some strength and some patience. For example, Kurt Tucholsky, who was one of the most famous reviewers, critics, journalists in the Weimar Republic in the 20s in Germany, he didn't like James Joyce at all, and he said, well, this is a strange book. There's some very strong parts in it, but the whole thing seems like, I don't know what it is in English. In German you have, if you make, it's like a brood for cooking, you have very concentrated brood, little cubes of, I don't know how you call it, pardon? Gruel, yeah. It's something like that, and you can make many soups out of it, And this book is like something like this, and you will cook many soups out of it, but as such, you cannot really eat it.
I think this is working.
I think there's a difference then. I mean, if I wanted to read Ulysses and I wanted someone to, as it were, quickly explain to me the basic idea of Ulysses. There's a very good book by Anthony Burgess about Ulysses, actually, which I read. And Burgess just tells you this book is about, based on this, and it's about that. But I don't really consider that to be criticism. I mean, that is more information. If there's a new writer that I'm reading, I would look it up on, unfortunately, on Wikipedia. You get the background, you get some sense of who this person was, where they lived, and so on. That's information. Literary criticism, though, I think, is a different matter, and is really a matter of taste and of opinion. And it's interesting how taste and opinion dates more than the book. I mean, if you read, for instance, if you read Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, a great novel, and you read the criticism of it, the book is much more interesting than the criticism, particularly someone like Leavis, for instance. And most of the criticism is completely dead, and also very, very badly written compared to the actual book itself. So it seems to me that most criticism actually is worthless and neither here nor there compared to what is substantial about a real work.
Alok had me at decoding. Yes, Munisa, sorry.
I just, this thing about whether it's worthless, and because literary criticism changes, it changes with one's perceptions. The writing that I am most familiar, things like the way women's writing has been read. I found this history of English, I was talking about this the other day, I found this history of English literature, which was a standard text in lots of classrooms, and it was reprinted between 1948 and 1974 about 30 times. And this wretched book had one paragraph on American literature. There is some good literature in America, and they had Eugene O'Neill. And women, of course, were all, either they were spinsters, or they had eloped, or they were blue stockings, I mean, men were never discussed like this. But the point is, there was this book. It has been challenged, and that challenge, we look at literature in a different way. And I think it's what the great George Steiner, I heard him say. He said, a writer writes a book. It's an immediate thing, and of course a great work does have that immortality in a sense. But he says what we do as critics is we build an architecture around it. We look at it, we re-examine it, and we re-examine it. And that creates in itself, or should create, if you're a critic worth the name, a very dynamic discourse which can be challenged. And challenge is also a dynamic process. It's not a dead process. It's not as if a work of literary criticism is the last word and no one's going to question it and no one's going to challenge it, or no one's even going to go back to it and say, hey, that was right, and then between the intervening 200 years it was considered rubbish. So I see it actually as a very dynamic process. And I see it as a very necessary adjunct to literature, although I do not see it as a kind of challenge to it in as much as, literary criticism is greater than the book.
Right. Thank you. I think that, I spot so many people in the audience that have a lot to say on the subject, and I'd like to give them the opportunity to ask questions, if that's all right with the panel. Is that okay? Yeah. So, right there, can I hand over the...
Readership, of course, and I'm not necessarily picking on good readership. Reader is a reader. So, and I think this becomes a very annoying process as well for authors sometimes. I would like to know the author's perspective on readers interpreting, and sometimes they say critics killed John Keats. I don't know how far that is true.
I'm sorry, critics?
Killed
John Keats.
John Keats, they say.
Okay.
Reviewers.
Okay.
Reviewers, he said.
Yeah, the reviewers.
Anyone going to answer that? Or?
I don't understand the question at all.
That the readers actually can kill a book.
The author's perspective, on the readership, like sometimes the readers are very annoying, or the interpreters or the critics. Authors may not be liking, like Toni Morrison would say, I don't see what critics say. So.
Well, I think the readers are not stupid. Most readers know, it's very simple. The most best-selling books in Germany get the worst reviews. So you can either say the readers are stupid because they don't follow the reviews, or the readers are very smart because they know what the reviewers say is not what they might think. So they buy the book.
Buy the book. Yes. I think it's on. It should be on.
It's a very simple question. How does literary criticism enrich the writer?
I think if I may try that as an answer, I think there's always a dynamic relation between the writer and the critic. I don't think that all literary criticism or literary critics are write rubbish. I think large number of writers also write rubbish. So I think to look for the ideal novel or the ideal critic is always a difficult task. But there is a dynamic relationship between the tradition that the literary critic also creates, within which the writer functions. And without that, you will not have a dynamic and a good literary writing at all. Yeah? And you might want to keep in mind that some of the best writers are also some of the best critics. As an example, T.S. Eliot, who is a great critic in his own right, just as he was also a great poet, and very self-conscious of the literary tradition within which he was functioning, both as a writer and as a critic. Yeah? So there is always this relationship. And if you have a society which has weak literary criticism, you also have a society which has weak literary tradition.
Just an intervention. Traditions, decoding, architecture. Isn't that what fiction and good writing is supposed to explode?
Yes.
And literary critics bring it right back to that?
Yes, I think it happens all the time. The great, the significant text breaks that tradition that is created. Just think of Waiting for Godot as an example. It brings into existence something which had not been thought of before. Something which did not exist. Think of Ibsen's A Doll's House with a door closing. It brings to a world a new, radically new way of thinking. Or I might add to Hanif Qureshi's beautiful Laundrette becomes important because it brings a new, kind of idiom and a new structure, and appeals to a constituency in England which had not been thought of before. So yes, it explodes it. That is its function. So the function of literary criticism, I think, is to create that tradition, and the function of the great writer is to act against it and break it.
Would you like to respond to that before we give it to...
I'd be interested to hear what people seem to think, what people might think about the fact that since the internet and new forms of social media, there is more and more content. Anybody can write a book and put it on the net. Yes. It may be the case then that we actually might need people of fine discrimination and good readers in order to tell us amongst millions and millions of manuscripts that are turning out that are available to us, which are the good ones, so that the good critic is a person who, as it were, is a sort of taster who can bear to taste all this tons of rubbish to find something in it that might be worthwhile. So far from it being the case that in fact the literary critic has gone because publicity has taken over, it may be the case that we might require people of fine distinction in order to tell us what is worth reading and what isn't. And I think it might be worth discussing that a bit.
One person of fine, tastes, I would say, actually said, I'll be very specific. Daniel Moinouddin's, in other rooms, other wonders is badly written. All right. So here's something like, you can't use the same word twice in the same paragraph. You can't keep saying, alliterating on and, and so forth. I mean, it's badly written. Full stop. That's one thing, like a fine, good taste says that. The other thing I basically want to throw at, ask you guys is, if I write concrete poetry, I tend to write like Joyce. Do I have a showcase? Can I publish?
shall we take another question and then, is there another question? Did I see a hand go up there? Just a sec, we can get a mic to you? We can get a...
Well, I don't know if I need a mic. I just wondered whether you're talking about curating, sort of taste making as opposed to, I think what they're talking about is something different.
Yeah.
Which is you take a significant work and try to add to the canon and try to see whether it fits into the canon.
Yeah.
That, I think, is a very different kind of tradition. And I think that's invariable. We really need as much as we need curating.
there was a question back there, sir?
Every time you are looking at internet text, you are actually indulging in literary criticism. That is why you're either rejecting or not. And this comment about Daniel Moinouddin, for instance, his comment that's bad writing, or what I had said earlier to him, and I'd now say it publicly, is that Arundhati Roy writes badly. Yeah, but I am therefore indulging in literary criticism. I am making a certain kind of choice. I am passing a certain kind of judgment. And a certain kind of judgment does not come out of vacuum. It comes out of a vast amount of reading, in which I am comparing a text against what I consider good writing. He had mentioned Lawrence as an example. I think Lawrence writes fabulously, whereas somebody else doesn't. Now, what that term fabulously or well contains will have to be explained and explicated and talked about, and it can be done so only in relationship to a tradition of literary criticism which I have been indulging in.
I just wanted to say that to me there's a bit of a confusion here between the academy, which is, a whole discipline, which is, actually studying literature and analysing it, which probably presumes to some extent a canon, And then what I had thought of as literary criticism, which is more the immediate, the now, the reviews that are appearing in newspapers or on the net or whatever. So we have a new prize in the UK, which is called Hatchet Job, which is a prize for somebody who writes a really trenchant and possibly quite aggressive analysis of a book but saying it's a bad book. And that might belong more in the latter tradition, which is, I think, more around maybe selling newspapers, getting readers for books which are being published now. And that to me is quite discrete from, you know, the academy and the canon, so it might just be worth making that distinction.
Okay, thank you. And here, Claire? Microphone coming. Up here, right here.
But I mean, it seems as though there's lots of different genres within literary criticism from what you've been saying. I mean, there's the book review, and there's the sort of taste-making or curating that you spoke about. There's the literary criticism before the book's published, you know, creative writing sort of criticism, and literary criticism afterwards that's about history and social context. So I wonder, and actually things aren't that easily separable because academics do write book reviews and writers write criticism, as you said. So is there a question here of genres as there is in any kind of literature?
Is another one there? We're just getting all the comments, as many as we can, because it's such short time. I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to talk. It was no more? Okay. Any responses here?
Well, I could try to respond to the question about academic and people who function in canons and those who whose job it is to carry books to daily readers. Just want to point out that some of the best literary critics, reviewers in England have also been using the review to write literary criticism of the very highest kind. For instance, when V.S. Pritchard was alive, he was doing all his literary criticism in the form of book reviews, which were carrying the best that had been written and thought about. And I know that sounds old Arnoldian, but best that had been written and thought about to an audience, and making that discrimination, which is important. So yes, to be a good reviewer, I would add that you have to be a good academic.
And a good writer.
And a good writer, yes, thank you.
Because I think a good review, or like any good journalistic text, is an art on its own, you know. And there are reviews, but I can tell, like T.S. Eliot reviews, which are at the same time literary criticism in the sense of academic criticism to some degree. But there are literary reviews, for example, in German literature, as I said, I mentioned Tucholsky, for example, or another one, nearly forgotten, is Alfred Kerr. He wrote reviews of theater pieces, theater reviews, and you can read those reviews nowadays. They're reviews of theater pieces which were on stage in the 20s or even before the First World War, and you can read it and you can enjoy it. And this is something very special, I think.
I seem to be hearing that the authors that we are talking about and the literary critics that canons of literature, and is there a time issue involved? Should there be literary criticism of contemporary writers, or should we have a time moratorium? They should be dead for at least 100 years or 50 years before we start to figure out what they meant to the time that they existed in. Should there be a distinction of that sort? Because I seem to see a fine line between book reviews that are meant to commoditize fiction and have them sell, and that's being used as some sort of literary criticism. So what do you think about that? Putting a moratorium.
If you had a moratorium, you won't sell books.
That's right.
Well, no, it's not only that. I mean, if you put a moratorium 100 years later, well, I mean, let's go back to the forbidden, well, I'm not going to talk about satanic verses. Let's go back to Salman Rushdie. Let's talk about something in our presence. Let's talk about Midnight's Children. I'm not going to talk about satanic verses. That's a banned text over here that we're going to. But let's talk about Midnight's Children, which is a fundamentally important book.
Yes.
What he did with language. Now, if you leave that, supposing, and you know, when he wrote this book, when he wrote this book with his mishmash of English and things, and he drew on different traditions, because we had a sense of inadequacy about our language and our use of language. I actually met people, because he came here on a British Council tour when he did Midnight's Children, and he charmed this entire audience, and that's before he became notorious. I actually met people after that who said, we liked that book, but there were times he didn't use English right. He didn't really know, he doesn't get the English right, it's not proper English. And if you didn't have literary criticism, and it was immediate criticism, it was book reviews, and he said when he came that time, he was stunned at the response to this book. This is what I'm talking about. George Steinholtz, a writer, writes a book. He wrote this book. He locked himself away for 3 years. He played, he said to me in an interview, he played around with language. He said, I wanted to break down the rhythms of standard English to incorporate a sound that was subcontinental. So he messes around. He says he and his publisher sat there and thought, God, who's going to buy this book? And suddenly it was this huge success, and that huge success had a lot to do with book reviews, with literary response. And if we waited 100 years for that, well, we don't know. And he changed the whole of subcontinental literature. He opened out a new language. That language had been rattling inside us, but none of us had the confidence to actually use it and explore it. So you can't really, I think, place literary criticism in that kind of a distant, a remote sort of box, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yes, over here. Yes, please.
I was just wondering, with reference to time, moratorium, and 100 years, I forget what Muniza said, and
both of us call Muniza, by the way.
What is the role of electronic, use that category, what is the role of electronic media and television on creative writing and in the concept or the volume of literary criticism with reference to English literature? Like,
Would you like to answer that? You're going to go to that.
Well, there are book programs, there are certainly book programs on British television, but they're mostly chatter. They're not really serious, and you wouldn't expect to hear anything particularly illuminating. I mean, they are a form of publicity, and I think publicity is different to reviewing, and reviewing is different to criticism, as we talked about today, although I think, who was it talked about? Pritchett. I think that was very interesting, that he was actually working for reasonably popular newspapers and writing a very high quality of so-called criticism that you could still read today. But most criticism now has become academic, and is mostly in academic journals, and is written in a language that most people can't understand. But I think a lot of academic criticism is also very interesting too. So we have several different, quite different approaches to the text. Still, at least people are interested in books.
And that's a blessing.
I think, may I address that a little more? I think literary criticism, which is theory-driven, can be very dull and be written in a language which is by and large incomprehensible even to the academics. That's one kind of thing. The second, about the television thing, I think it's very important to see the relationship that television or film has had on literature. I think that is fascinating, and it has been enormous, both ways. So that you have very literary television, if you like, but you also have literary fiction of literary texts, which are deeply influenced by the new media, and that needs to be understood in some very complex ways.
In reference to what you said, I was just wondering, are you then suggesting, in reference to what Anil said, that the print media, the written word, has an edge over, at least an edge over electronic media, in terms of richness and permanence?
That also comes through written.
No, I mean, a beautiful laundrette on TV is as important to me as reading the text, or it makes the text also come alive in different ways. So there are equal importances to different kinds of media. And one needs to have, let me just quote again what I said, an educated responsiveness to all that. Yeah, one needs to look at the media also within its tradition, yeah, in the ways in which it brings certain written word into the general public's homes, just as literary criticism, fiction or plays are responding to the television also. So large amount of our language, for instance, is coming from the television. Yeah.
I just wanted to actually go off, because you're talking, I know, in a wider context about the electronic media and the online media. I want to relate it to Pakistan, because this is something that I've seen, that how it has changed the book reading patterns, how it's changed our bookshops. Before, because now we've got the Dawn books and authors, we've got literati, but before, when there were not book reviews and so on, and where your only knowledge of new books, the book trade was very limited, it was very fragile. Some random person would come from abroad and say, oh, I read a good book. And all books were reviewed here, which were not available in the market. And with the electronic media, with the online, with the satellite, with literary discussions, your awareness of books, I mean, to bring it closer home, I don't know. I mean, we've got a literary festival going on, we've got a wonderful turnout, wonderful audience. Would we have had this same response, say, 30 years ago, when we did not have electronic media, when we did not have the same books available in our bookshops? So it's made a very profound difference to our society and to our book reading publics and our bookshops.
I agree. Bina, you had a question here? Or no? Okay, let's see. All right, would you have a question?
Muniza, this is to you.
To me? I'm the moderator.
No, Muniza.
All right, okay. Okay.
Academic literary criticism in Pakistan. How do you look at that now?
Well,
you have a history. I know
actually,
you have been writing a lot.
No, I've been writing, but you actually asked me. I'm not an academic.
But you write academically, I must say.
Well, that's very kind of you. So, that's very kind. What I can't actually tell you about is what is happening within Pakistani academia. People are kind enough, they do invite me, I do go and speak on Pakistani English literature at the universities, but I don't actually know the day-to-day workings of what is being produced. On a wider context, because I did do this Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, we did have some academic, it was a mix of critical and creative work.
Is this the high time to bridge the gap, if there is any?
This is absolutely what I became aware when I was doing this. It was an academic journal. They were kind enough to ask me to do it. I became aware of the fact that there was very little academic work on our own literature coming out of Pakistan. And I also discovered that in Europe and in America, academics are falling over themselves to write about Pakistani English literature, of which there is not enough coming out from our own country. But what is actually the daily, you are actually much better knowledge of what is happening within academia than I am.
Yeah. We are actually introducing Pakistani literature all over.
That's great.
Yeah. In universities, we are now working on introducing subcontinental and Pakistani literature, of course. And I think that is where I feel this gap still to be there. And that is what I'm asking, okay, how do we bridge this gap?
How do we bridge this gap?
Yeah, I mean, like authors need to visit academia at the time. Or academics need to come to such forums. So more of such things happen.
Would you like to answer that?
How do we bridge, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get, how do we bridge the gap between?
Like, there was a time when Pakistani lit was, as you said, American lit,
American literature, yes.
not accepted. There was a time. Now we live in different times. There is more talk about subcontinental Pakistani literature over here now. So how do we move
The
ahead?
Pakistani readership is reading its own authors rather than British authors.
Maybe I'm talking
rather
from
than-
the political perspective of canonizing. Now it is being canonized.
It's just being canonized. We also, I mean, the various books that are being done, the work, I mean, there was immensely valuable work is being done by Alamgir Hashmi and Tariq Rahman. I mean, there is nothing that any of us are doing in this field, in literary criticism for Pakistani English, without the work of these two writers. And there was also quite a lot happening in the 1960s and 70s when you had people like Tawfiq Rafat who was talking about idiom. So we have had this process going on. What has not happened until recently, and where we've now got this sort of great burst of talent, what has not happened until recently is the link between the readership and what's happening in academia. And I'm really glad that it is being, because you see, unless it starts being introduced in academics, unless those texts, when they're published here, go into the classroom, it doesn't really permeate into society as it should. And it remains a kind of thing on the edge, and then you keep getting these debates about these are people who are living from the outside or they're middle class or whatever. A lot of the literature, one of the big criticisms, of course, is that it's all these, privileged middle-class people who can write English. But actually that's not true. What has happened is because there's a kind of globalization, you've got a very strong working-class literature, working-class people whose parents migrated to Britain or America. And there is a working-class Pakistani English literature emerging. And there is also another new thing that I've noticed, a lot of writers. Now this is another debate about language. There's a lot of writers who come from Urdu speaking or Punjabi speaking backgrounds are now also writing in English. And you get Musharraf Farooqi comes to mind,
And a lot of
Hanif.
translations are also being done. A lot of translations are also being done.
A lot of translations are being done, that's another dimension.
Bina, a quick question from you.
Real quick.
Okay.
Going back to social media, Hanif, you had put on Facebook maybe a week ago, you wanted to create a page where people could put up writing. Were you successful in doing that, and what do you plan to do with whatever people post up there?
I haven't read the material yet, mostly because I've been here, but I thought what Muniza was saying was very interesting because there are some really good writers coming out of Pakistan at the moment, and it seems to me very important that this writing is, as it were, reintegrated through the schools, through the colleges and through the universities, that young people are aware of what a flowering this is and how valuable this writing is, and that they can learn from this and then write themselves. And I think you probably need academics, reviewers and critics, as it were, to acquaint young people with what is happening in their own society and to make it part of literary canon in this country too. So I thought that was really, I think that's really important, that as it were, it often takes too long for new writing to be recognized as being important, as being part of the literary canon, as being seen as real literature. And I think a critic or an academic, and certainly a teacher, should be able to do that.
Any last comments on the panel?
So just this comment that on the subject of building a canon, I would really like to see out of Pakistan and India a good critical evaluation of Manto as an example. We don't have one. What we get are either biographies or we get descriptions. What we have not succeeded in doing in both the countries thus far is to have a very lively, strong, critical tradition within which all these texts can be talked about. Like you, we are also beginning to integrate Indian texts into our literary syllabi.
University of Pittsburgh will publish this South Asian review, which has Indian and Pakistani
Yes, sir.
papers. What is being done now?
It's now 11 o'clock, and I hate to let you all go, but I realized that I was so nervous about this panel that I forgot to introduce the panel. But I think that no one on this panel needs an introduction. If you insist, I could read out their introductions to you. No need? No. Okay, all right. Thank you, and thanks for coming, and thank you very much, Hanif, Munita, Alok. Thank you for doing it on time.
Oh my God.